Major developments to break down carefully today, and there's a genuinely significant amount of ground to cover before we're through. New reporting indicates the American president has been carefully weighing whether to launch a renewed large-scale bombing campaign against Iran to break the current deadlock in negotiations, even as American troops and naval assets continue flowing steadily into the region rather than drawing down at all. At the same time, explosions and gunfire have rocked Baghdad amid an intensifying crackdown on Iran-aligned militias in Iraq. A fragile Iranian state funeral is entering its final stretch this week, and fresh reporting has surfaced about a serious rift between Washington and Riyadh that nearly derailed one of the war's most significant naval operations to date. There's a lot to get through today, so let's break it all down piece by piece carefully. Start with the reporting on renewed strikes, because this is the headline that matters most today and deserves to be understood precisely rather than in vague, sensationalized terms. According to reporting that, built on earlier Wall Street Journal coverage, the American president has recently considered resuming large-scale military operations against Iran, but has for now chosen to continue prioritizing diplomatic negotiations instead. The reasoning behind that choice is important, and it's worth stating precisely rather than paraphrasing loosely. The administration reportedly believes that another major air campaign right now could undermine the ongoing effort to negotiate durable limits on Iran's nuclear program and could further destabilize a region that is already dealing with multiple overlapping crises simultaneously. At the same time, targeted retaliatory strikes remain very much on the table as a tool to respond to specific Iranian violations, which is exactly what played out in the final week of June when American aircraft struck Iranian coastal missile, drone, and radar sites near Sirik, Jask, Keshm Island, and Bandar Abbas after Iranian drones hit two separate commercial tankers transiting the strait. So here's the actual picture as it stands today. This is not a binary choice between all-out war and complete diplomatic patience. It's a calibrated strategy of preserving military leverage while giving the negotiating track additional time to produce something durable, with targeted strikes used as a release valve whenever Iran crosses a specific line, rather than as the opening move in a full, renewed campaign. That distinction matters enormously for understanding what's likely to happen next. The current posture suggests restraint is still the operative strategy, but restraint with a hard floor underneath it, a floor that gets tested essentially every time Iran targets another tanker or launches another round of drones at a Gulf base. It's worth understanding why the administration would prefer this calibrated approach over either extreme, because the reasoning isn't simply caution for its own sake. A full renewed bombing campaign carries real, well-understood risks that go beyond the immediate military exchange. Iran has already demonstrated its capacity to retaliate broadly across the region, striking American-aligned states like Bahrain and Kuwait, threatening the Fifth Fleet's own regional headquarters, and disrupting a shipping lane that carries a meaningful share of the world's oil supply every single day. A large-scale campaign risks triggering exactly that kind of broad retaliation on a larger scale, sending oil prices sharply higher, straining relationships with regional partners who would bear the brunt of Iranian counterstrikes, and potentially collapsing whatever diplomatic progress has been made in Doha entirely. Weighed against those risks, a policy of targeted proportional retaliation, paired with a heavily reinforced military posture that could pivot to something larger on short notice, represents a genuinely reasonable middle path, provided Iran doesn't force the issue by crossing a line severe enough to make that middle path politically untenable. Whether that restraint holds depends heavily on how Iran itself continues behaving in the days ahead, and here, Iran has not been making the diplomatic path easy. Iran's leadership has consistently signaled, through direct statements and through its actions in the Strait itself, that it has no genuine interest in fully surrendering its stockpile of highly enriched uranium, and no interest whatsoever in giving up practical control over the Strait of Hormuz, the waterway through which close to a fifth of the world's oil supply moves on any given day. Every time Iran tests that specific red line, striking a tanker, threatening a vessel, warning shipping companies to seek its own permission before transiting, it raises the odds that American patience eventually runs out and the calculus shifts back toward the kind of sustained air campaign the administration has so far chosen to hold in reserve. If that shift happens, the tools available are not subtle. Analysts tracking the region have pointed specifically to the same aircraft that have carried this campaign from the beginning, B-1 and B-2 bombers capable of delivering massive ordnance against hardened underground facilities, backed by fighter escort and electronic warfare support, as the platforms that would carry out any renewed, large-scale operation if talks in Doha ultimately collapse. Now here's the part of this story that deserves the most attention, because it tells you more about what's actually likely to happen than any single public statement from either government involved in this standoff. Pay attention to what's happening on the ground, rather than what officials are saying in press conferences, because the actions consistently tell a clearer story than the rhetoric surrounding them. According to U.S. Central Command, amphibious assault ships, including the USS Boxer and USS Portland, continue operating inside the CENTCOM area of responsibility, with the 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit embarked aboard the Boxer as part of a full amphibious ready group that also includes the USS Comstock. That's not a token presence. A Marine Expeditionary Unit is a complete, self-contained combat force built around a reinforced infantry battalion with its own aviation squadron and logistic support, capable of launching operations on short notice. Alongside that group, the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit remains embarked aboard the USS Tripoli, meaning 2 full Marine Expeditionary Units are currently positioned in the theater simultaneously, a combined ground-capable force that, together with Army elements also deployed to the region, brings total additional American ground forces in the area to somewhere in the range of 7,000 to 10,000 troops, according to defense officials. Even while a fragile ceasefire technically holds, even while sporadic strikes and retaliatory fire continue in both directions, the United States has not drawn down its military footprint in the Middle East. If anything, it continues surging additional resources into theater. CENTCOM has previously stated that roughly 50,000 American troops remain positioned across the region, ready to respond if the situation deteriorates further. That is not the posture of a military that believes this conflict is winding down. It's the posture of a force that expects it may need to move quickly, with assets already in place. The moment negotiations break down or Iran crosses a line the administration has decided it will not tolerate. Both Marine Expeditionary Units currently positioned in the Gulf carry genuine institutional experience relevant to exactly this kind of theater. The 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit has a documented history of amphibious operations in this specific region dating back decades, while both units carry the F-35B, the vertical takeoff variant of the Marine Corps' stealth fighter, giving them organic air support without depending on land-based airfields in countries whose willingness to host American strike operations has proven, as we'll get into shortly with the Saudi situation, considerably less reliable than officials might prefer. That combination of self-contained air power and rapid amphibious assault capability is exactly the kind of force posture you'd expect to see if planners wanted the option to seize a specific, limited objective. A contested island, a stretch of coastline, a key piece of infrastructure, without needing weeks of additional buildup once the order came down. Now, let's turn to Iraq, because the situation there has deteriorated significantly over recent days and deserves serious, careful attention entirely on its own terms, separate from everything happening in the Gulf. In recent days, a major fire and series of explosions rocked the airport in Baghdad, unfolding against a backdrop of significant combat operations and an intensifying crackdown against Iranian-aligned armed groups across the country. Iraq's government has been actively working to push these groups out, arrest their members, and disarm them entirely, following a formal deadline set earlier this year requiring Iran-aligned militias to disarm completely or face direct military consequences from Iraqi forces themselves. Reports from the ground describe intense gunfire and explosions in Baghdad over recent nights, with both Iraqi and American forces reportedly engaging and shooting down drones as the confrontation between the Iraqi government and Iran-backed factions continues to intensify. This is a genuinely significant front in this broader conflict that gets far less attention than the Gulf and Lebanon fronts, but it represents one of the clearest signs that Iran's regional network of allied militias is under serious, sustained pressure on multiple fronts simultaneously, not just from Israel and the United States directly, but from host governments that have decided the cost of tolerating these groups on their own soil has become too high to continue absorbing. The Iraqi government's calculation here deserves a closer look, because it represents a genuinely difficult balancing act for a state that has spent decades navigating between competing American and Iranian influence inside its own borders. Iran-aligned militias in Iraq have operated for years with considerable autonomy, drawing on funding, weapons, and training from Tehran, while nominally existing within Iraq's own security structure. Baghdad's decision to set a hard disarmament deadline and back it with actual military action represents a significant break from that historical pattern, one presumably driven by growing recognition that hosting these groups exposes Iraq itself to exactly the kind of American and Israeli strikes that have devastated Iranian military infrastructure elsewhere in the region. Every militia position dismantled inside Iraq is simultaneously a retreat for Iran's regional network and a genuine, measurable gamble for the Iraqi government, since these same militias retain enough independent capability to make any disarmament campaign a violent, costly undertaking, rather than a simple administrative order. Now, let's get into the negotiating picture, because this is where things get genuinely complicated, and where Iran's actual position becomes considerably clearer once you look past the diplomatic language being used publicly by officials on both sides of the table. According to reporting building on Wall Street Journal sourcing, Iran has signaled through Qatari mediation channels that it will move to close the Strait of Hormuz once again if the Doha talks fail to guarantee Iran exclusive control over the waterway. and if the United States and other Western states refuse to abandon the southern corridor route that runs closer to Omani territorial waters. Read that carefully, because it tells you exactly what Iran's actual negotiating position is, stripped of diplomatic framing. If a vessel uses the Omani-backed corridor, Iran has demonstrated a willingness to strike it. If a vessel attempts to use the American-established route, Iran has demonstrated a willingness to strike that too. And now Iran is making its position explicit through official channels, insisting that it, and only it, gets to decide which routes are safe and which are not, with any disagreement on that specific point treated as grounds to shut the entire waterway down and threaten the flow of a meaningful share of the world's oil supply. Iranian officials have reportedly gone further still, indicating that Tehran will not discuss any other issue in the peace talks until the question of control over the strait is fully settled in Iran's favor. Senior Iranian sources have said the country intends to keep control over the waterway and could resume charging commercial vessels a formal transit fee as early as the middle of August, precisely when the 60-day free passage window built into the Memorandum of Understanding, signed in mid-June, is set to expire. That specific timeline deserves attention because it means the current, relatively calm shipping picture in the strait is not evidence of a durable resolution. It's evidence of a temporary truce with a built-in expiration date, one that both sides know is coming and that Iran has already signaled it intends to use as leverage the moment it arrives. That August deadline effectively functions as a second parallel countdown clock running alongside the broader 60-day negotiating window, and the two clocks don't necessarily align in ways that make a peaceful resolution easier. If the nuclear and broader political provisions of any eventual settlement remain unresolved by that date, but Iran moves forward with reintroducing a transit fee regardless, the United States and its allies will face a genuinely difficult choice. Accept the fee as a fait accompli and treat it as a separate, lesser issue from the broader nuclear settlement, or treat its introduction as a fundamental violation of the spirit of the memorandum, regardless of technical compliance with its specific 60-day wording, and respond accordingly. Neither option is clean, and the ambiguity built into that overlap is likely to become one of the sharpest flashpoints in this entire conflict once August actually arrives. Diplomatically, the picture remains genuinely murky, with both sides offering competing accounts of where things actually stand. Qatar's foreign ministry has confirmed separate rounds of talks involving both American and Iranian decision-makers in Doha, with American officials, including senior envoys involved in Middle East diplomacy, traveling to Qatar specifically to discuss a range of issues, including Iran's nuclear program and its broader denuclearization. Iranian officials, meanwhile, have at various points denied that formal talks are even underway, creating a genuinely confusing situation where both governments are effectively negotiating as much through public statements and competing narratives as they are through actual closed-door diplomatic channels. That kind of public competing narrative isn't a minor communications problem. It reflects a negotiation where neither side fully trusts the other's account of what's actually been discussed or agreed to, which makes any eventual deal considerably harder to build genuine confidence around, even if the substantive terms themselves eventually get worked out. Now, here's a piece of this story that deserves considerably more attention than it's gotten in most coverage so far, because it reveals just how much strain this conflict has placed on America's relationships with its own regional partners, not just its declared adversary. One of the most significant developments to emerge from deeper reporting on this war involves a serious and previously unreported disagreement between Washington and Riyadh. According to the Wall Street Journal, Saudi Arabia initially refused to allow the American military to use its bases and airspace for an operation known as Project Freedom, a mission specifically intended to protect commercial shipping and break Iran's grip over the Strait of Hormuz by escorting stranded vessels safely out of the waterway. Saudi bases and airspace were considered critical to that operation's success, and Riyadh's refusal reportedly forced the United States to abort the mission within roughly 2 days of its launch. At the time, the American president publicly attributed the operation's cancellation to diplomatic progress in talks with Iran. The actual reporting tells a considerably different story, one where Saudi Arabia's refusal, not diplomatic breakthrough, was the decisive factor that killed the mission. What followed was a genuinely tense standoff between the two governments. Frustrated by Riyadh's decision, the White House reportedly threatened to delay deliveries of critical air defense interceptor systems that Saudi Arabia had been actively relying on to shoot down Iranian missiles and drones targeting its own territory throughout this conflict. Facing that pressure, Saudi Arabia ultimately relented, and Project Freedom resumed in a more limited, covert form. But the episode reportedly exposed one of the deepest strains in the U.S.-Saudi security relationship in years, according to officials familiar with the matter, and the underlying damage has not been easily undone. Saudi Arabia had separately pushed the United States throughout the war to abandon its naval blockade of Iranian ports entirely, preferring a return to the negotiating table over continued military pressure, a request the administration declined to honor until the ceasefire memorandum was finally signed in mid-June. It's worth being precise about the actual sequence here, because the full picture is more layered than a single refusal followed by a single reversal. Saudi Arabia and Kuwait initially suspended American access to bases and airspace shortly after the operation was publicly announced, forcing an early pause within roughly 2 days of launch. That access was restored in early May following direct, high-level phone diplomacy between the American president and the Saudi crown prince, clearing the way for the operation's restart. The fact that it took a direct head-of-state phone call, paired with the implicit threat of withheld defense equipment, to resolve a disagreement over regional basing rights between two governments that have described themselves as close strategic partners for decades, tells you plainly just how seriously Saudi Arabia weighed the risk of hosting the specific operation against the value of its broader relationship with Washington. The fallout from that specific disagreement has continued playing out in ways that go well beyond a single canceled operation. American officials have reportedly been considering a meaningful reduction of the U.S. military presence inside Saudi Arabia specifically, shifting greater focus and resources toward countries that were viewed as more cooperative during the height of the conflict. Saudi Arabia's own crown prince reportedly declined an invitation to attend a G7 summit that the American president did attend, in what sources familiar with the matter described as a deliberate protest over how Washington handled the broader war. A senior American cabinet official's visit to the Gulf, which included stops in the UAE, Kuwait, and Bahrain, but conspicuously not Saudi Arabia, was reportedly viewed in Riyadh as a pointed diplomatic snub. None of this rises to the level of an open rupture between the two governments, but it represents a genuinely serious erosion of trust between Washington and one of its most important regional security partners, precisely at a moment when regional unity matters enormously for whatever comes next in this conflict. It's worth understanding why Saudi Arabia balked at hosting that specific operation in the first place, because the reasoning reveals something important about how exposed America's regional partners feel in this entire conflict. After the United States and Israel launched their initial campaign against Iran back in February, Gulf states that allowed their bases to be used for strikes found themselves absorbing the brunt of Iran's retaliatory response almost immediately. Saudi Arabia itself launched a number of its own strikes against Iranian drone and missile sites during the war, and separately watched an American radar and control aircraft get destroyed by an Iranian projectile strike at one of its own air bases. Every Gulf government hosting American operations against Iran has had to weigh the value of that partnership against the very real risk of becoming a direct target themselves, and Saudi Arabia's initial refusal to host Project Freedom reflects exactly that calculation. A government trying to protect itself from exactly the kind of retaliatory strike its own territory had already absorbed once before. That calculation extends well beyond any single country's individual risk tolerance and speaks to a broader pattern shaping how this entire war has been fought from the American side. Every strike package, every naval operation, every amphibious rehearsal depends on a web of regional basing and overflight agreements that can be withdrawn or restricted at the host government's discretion, essentially at any moment for reasons that may have nothing to do with the immediate operational plan itself. That dependency represents a genuine strategic vulnerability that doesn't show up on any weapons inventory or troop count, but that has already proven capable of forcing the outright cancellation of a major American military operation once already in this conflict. Any future large-scale campaign against Iran will face that exact same vulnerability, regardless of how many additional troops, ships, or aircraft get positioned in the region beforehand. The broader economic toll of this ongoing standoff over the strait continues mounting steadily as well beyond the direct military and diplomatic costs already discussed above. Dubai's hotel occupancy rate has reportedly collapsed to roughly a tenth of its pre-war level, according to analysis cited by the Wall Street Journal, a decline described by one major financial analytics firm as an effective shutdown of large portions of the region's hospitality sector. Qatar's liquefied natural gas exports have similarly ground to a near halt, with the country extending a formal declaration of force majeure on its LNG shipments well into the summer. Saudi Arabia, and to a lesser extent the UAE, have managed to keep exporting meaningful volumes of oil by relying on pipelines that bypass the strait entirely, routing crude overland to Red Sea ports instead, but that workaround covers only a fraction of the total volume that would normally move through the waterway by sea, and it does nothing to help the broader shipping, tourism, and trade sectors across the wider Gulf region that depend on normal maritime traffic to function. These economic figures matter for understanding the negotiating dynamics at play, because they represent real, ongoing costs that create pressure on every government involved to reach some kind of resolution, even if that pressure doesn't necessarily push all sides toward the same specific outcome. Gulf states watching their tourism and export revenue collapse have every incentive to want this standoff resolved quickly, which is part of why countries like Qatar and Oman have invested so heavily in mediating between Washington and Tehran rather than simply sitting on the sidelines. But Iran, despite its own severe domestic economic strain, has calculated that maintaining leverage over the strait is worth more to its broader negotiating position than the short-term economic pain of continued disruption, at least for now. That calculation could shift if Iran's internal economic pressure becomes severe enough. But as of today, Tehran continues to treat control over that waterway as non-negotiable, regardless of the mounting regional economic cost. Threats, meanwhile, continue flowing in multiple directions simultaneously this week, and it's worth cataloging them plainly and carefully, because together they paint a picture of just how combustible this entire situation genuinely remains beneath the surface calm of any given week. Israel's prime minister has stated that Israel stands ready to launch a third major strike campaign against Iran if it judges one necessary, making clear that Israel is prepared to act unilaterally regardless of what Washington decides. On the American side, continued troop movements into the region, alongside reported consideration of a renewed bombing campaign, suggest a posture where the United States would not simply stand aside and let Israel act entirely alone if a decision were made to strike again. Iran, for its part, has issued its own explicit threats in response. The Secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council has stated publicly that the matter of avenging Qasem Soleimani, the Quds Force commander killed in a 2020 American strike, remains an open file, warning that those responsible would eventually be punished and that the day for that reckoning would not be far off. Iran's foreign minister has separately stated that any threat against Iran would be met with an immediate and powerful response, while directing pointed language at Israel's government specifically, warning that ignoring Iranian warnings would result in consequences. Each of these statements deserves to be read in the context of who's actually making them and why, rather than taken purely at face value as a literal operational plan. Iran's Supreme National Security Council's secretary invoking Soleimani's memory serves a clear internal political purpose, independent of whether any concrete assassination plot is actually being planned, reinforcing the regime's narrative of ongoing resistance to a domestic audience currently living through severe economic hardship and mourning a supreme leader killed in this same war. Israel's prime minister stating readiness for a third strike campaign serves its own domestic and deterrent purpose, signaling resolve to both an Israeli public that has lived through repeated rounds of this conflict, and to Iranian decision-makers weighing whether continued provocation carries real consequences. None of that makes the underlying threats meaningless, but it does mean each statement needs to be weighed against the specific audience and purpose it's serving, rather than treated as a straightforward, literal preview of what happens next. Every one of these statements is a data point, and taken together, they describe a situation genuinely balanced on a knife's edge rather than moving cleanly toward either full resolution or renewed open conflict. The diplomatic track in Doha remains technically alive, even as both governments offer contradictory accounts of its actual progress. American military assets continue flowing into the region rather than drawing down, which by itself tells you the Pentagon is not betting heavily on imminent, durable peace. Iraq is dealing with its own intensifying internal confrontation between the government and Iran-aligned militias, a front that could easily spill over into the broader regional conflict if it escalates much further. And Saudi Arabia's relationship with Washington has been genuinely strained by disagreements over exactly how forcefully to confront Iran. A reminder that America's own regional coalition is not nearly as unified or reliable as official statements sometimes suggest. All of this is unfolding against the backdrop of Iran's own internal situation, which remains genuinely unsettled in ways that make predicting Tehran's next move even more difficult than usual. The country is currently in the final stretch of a multi-day state funeral for its late supreme leader, killed in the opening hours of the war back in February, with his successor having never once appeared in public since his own appointment months ago. The kind of internal uncertainty at the very top of Iran's leadership structure means that even Iranian officials negotiating in Doha may not have complete clarity on how much authority they genuinely hold to make binding commitments on behalf of their own government, a factor that complicates the diplomatic picture considerably beyond the substantive disagreements over the Strait and the nuclear program themselves. Layer onto that leadership uncertainty a severe domestic economic crisis that has been building for well over a year, a currency that has lost more than half its value against the dollar since before this war even started, inflation running near or above 70% on basic goods, and a mass protest movement last December that pulled merchants, students, and industrial workers into the streets simultaneously before being put down with significant loss of life. A government managing that level of internal strain, on top of an unresolved succession crisis, on top of an active war, has a genuinely limited bandwidth for consistent, coherent, long-term strategic decision-making, regardless of how confident its public statements sound. That internal fragility cuts in two directions for anyone trying to predict what happens next. It could make Iran more likely to eventually accept a deal simply to relieve some of that accumulated pressure, or it could push whichever faction currently holds the most practical power inside Tehran toward a louder, more aggressive posture, specifically to prove its own strength to a domestic audience watching for any sign of weakness at the top. So, where does all of this actually leave things as of today? The most reasonable, careful read of the available evidence right now is that renewed, large-scale strikes remain a real and seriously considered option rather than empty rhetoric, but one the administration continues to view as a genuine last resort rather than a first choice, provided the Doha talks can still produce meaningful progress once Iran's funeral concludes, and negotiators return to the table in earnest good faith. The military buildup underway across the region isn't necessarily evidence that war is imminent. It's evidence that the option is being kept fully loaded and ready, so that if diplomacy does ultimately fail, the response can be immediate rather than requiring weeks of additional buildup first. Iran, meanwhile, continues to signal through both its rhetoric and its actions in the Strait that it has no intention of giving up the leverage that waterway provides, regardless of what gets discussed at the negotiating table, which means the fundamental disagreement at the heart of this entire conflict remains every bit as unresolved today as it was when the ceasefire memorandum was first signed. It's worth stepping back for a moment and naming the handful of specific developments that would most clearly signal which direction this entire situation is actually heading, since they matter considerably more in the long run than any single day's rhetoric or headline. Whether Iran actually moves to reintroduce a transit fee once the free passage window expires in mid-August, and how the United States responds if it does. Whether the crackdown on Iran-aligned militias in Iraq continues to intensify, or whether some kind of negotiated settlement emerges there instead. Whether the strained relationship between Washington and Riyadh continues to deteriorate, or whether it stabilizes once the immediate tensions over Project Freedom fade. And whether Iran's own internal leadership, still working through an unresolved succession crisis following the death of its supreme leader, ends up producing a negotiating position stable enough to actually honor whatever gets agreed to in Doha, or whether the whole process remains hostage to a leadership structure that even Iranian officials themselves may not fully understand right now. Whether the coming weeks ultimately bring a genuine breakthrough in Doha, a return to open bombing campaigns, or simply another extended stretch of this same uneasy, technically violated ceasefire that has defined most of this year, continues to depend on decisions being made right now in rooms far removed from public view by governments on multiple sides that have each already demonstrated repeatedly over the course of this entire year a genuine willingness to escalate rather than back down when they believe their core national interests are truly at stake.